So, good morning and welcome to session 6 of the biology review session videos. This is the final review session video, and this one is on evolution and classification. So I want to start by just going over the definition of evolution. Evolution is defined as the change in a population of an organism over time. So it's defined as change over time. Okay. Evidence for evolution does show that there is change over time in a population and or that there are descent from common ancestors. So let's talk about some of the evidence for evolution. First, there are the fossil records. Fossils show how species have evolved over time and can show us some of the stages of that changes, the stages of those changes in the middle of them as well. So basically kind of the steps to the change from early ancestor to present day organism. So we are able to see from fossils the evolution of whales from land animals. We can actually see fossils of whales that possibly had, limbs that allowed them to walk on land. We have fossils that show the evolution of humans. We have fossils that show the evolution that dinosaurs actually evolved from birds. Used to be believed that dinosaurs were closer to reptiles, but we now know that that is not true. And even though the fossil record is not complete, there are lots of missing pieces in the fossil record. There are thousands of fossils that do support the theory of evolution, so there is enough to support this theory of evolution. And here are some examples of some of those fossils that have been found, showing us, you can see limbs, okay, to fins. So we've got starting off with actual limbs that maybe were used to walk on land from early ancestor fossils of this particular fish. Okay. We also have evidence in using comparative anatomy. One of the things that's used in comparative anatomy are what are called homologous structures. Homo means the same. So homologous structures are basically going to be the same basic parts that have evolved into different functions. So for instance, birds, a bird wing, the legs of humans, the flipper of a whale, all have the same bones internally, but they evolved, showing that they came from a common ancestor at some point in time. However, over time and with changes of environment for the different populations, they have evolved into doing different things. So here's some pictures of some of these. So you can see the bird, bat, human, lion, horse, frog, whale, all have these same setup of bones within their limb and or wing and or flipper. So they all have the same setup of these bones. Let me just, here we go, so I can point them out to you. A main upper bone. Then there's like these two forearm type bones. Some are more combined than others. Okay, and then like the hand and finger bones. And so those are all called homologous structures because internally they are the same. Now they all do different things though. Obviously the bones inside the wing are going to help for flying, whereas the frog, horse, lion, and human use their limbs for walking or movement on land. Whales, obviously they use the flipper for swimming. So functionally they are different because they are in different environments. But evolutionary-wise, they show that there was at some point a common ancestor for these particular organisms because they have this similar bone structure. Also have structures called vestigial structures that are going to show that there were common ancestors amongst different organisms. Vestigial structures are structures that had a function in an ancestor, but in the present day organism, they are small, reduced, and don't have a current function. So examples are the wisdom teeth in humans are considered vestigial structures. We don't need them for anything. However, it is thought that early ancestors of humans had more use for the wisdom teeth, which is why they are there. And now, as we have evolved into present-day humans, they've become smaller, and some people don't even have them, and we obviously don't need them. Whales and some snakes still have actually remnants of hind legs that their ancestors used when they walked on land and actually walked. And now, of course, whales and snakes do not use legs of any kind, so having those bones is not necessary, even though they still do, so they're called vestigial structures. And so here's a picture of a whale, and you can see in the hip area there's no need for these bones, but yet they're still there, and that is just that's a vestigial structure and remnants of what an ancestor would have had that walked on land. We can also take a look at embryos of the different organisms and see similarities between the early stages of embryos of different organisms, and we can see that they are very similar. For instance, if you take a look at early vertebrates, including humans, all embryos, which these are the early development of the organism, all early vertebrate embryos have tails, and that even includes humans. And dolphin embryos even have 4 legs, even though they don't have legs. Okay? So here's pictures. All right. This one in particular is the dolphin, and you can see that it's got what look like limb buds. It's got the tail. This is the human embryo, and you can see it's very similar in shape. Okay, so that would indicate, because they are similar in the early stages of development, that there at some point in time was possibly a common ancestor. Also, when we look at the DNA of organisms, we see that all organisms are going to have DNA, and for many organisms, there's a lot of similarity in their DNA codes. For instance, between humans and certain primates, it's 99% the same. So that actually shows that means that there is a possibility of common descent or a common ancestor for those particular organisms. So if you actually can, another way we know that the genetic code is universal for all organisms, which shows that they are all related in some way, is because we can actually take a gene or a portion of the DNA from one organism and put it into the DNA of another organism, and that organism will make the protein that the DNA coded for. So we read the DNA the same no matter what organism it comes from, because DNA is DNA is DNA. So for instance, something that has been done, taking a gene from a spider and putting it into a goat could have the spider, the goat would then produce the spider's protein. So you could, maybe have the production of a web, for instance. All right. Some of the things that are necessary for evolution to occur involve these main points, and we call this natural selection. Okay, so their natural selection is based on the fact that is basically the basis of evolution, and stating that the environment is going to kind of play a huge part in which characteristics are necessary, and so therefore organisms will change based on what is necessary for survival. So here are some of the major points of natural selection, okay, and the basis of evolution. Organisms will produce many more offspring than the environment can support, and that will survive, okay? So examples of this are, puffballs produce trillions of spores. A puffball is a type of fungus. A sea urchin will produce millions of eggs. Fruit flies produce about 200 eggs each time. So we're talking, large numbers for majority of offspring, or for majority of organisms. Produce much more offspring than can survive. And that is because environmental resources are limited, okay? And the environment can only support a certain amount, that carrying capacity that we talked about in the ecology unit. There's only so much that can live in a certain area. So what this does is it causes all of those offspring to compete for resources and basically struggle for survival, hence the survival of the fittest, okay? So there is going to be competition. And because of sexual reproduction, we have variation in organisms. Those offspring all have lots of variation, and some of those variations are better suited for the environment than others. So the ones that have the more favorable variations will be more likely to survive and can pass their characteristics on to their offspring, making their offspring have those favorable characteristics, whereas the organisms that don't have the favorable characteristics will be less likely to survive and will die off and basically not pass on those variations. So eventually certain variations that maybe were present at one point in time will no longer be present because they were not helping the survival of the organism. So let me sum this up. Natural selection basically says more offspring are produced than can survive. There's variation in that population of offspring. Some of those variations are favorable, some are not. The ones that are favorable will survive, the ones that are not will not survive. And this is what leads to change in the population. Hence, this is what leads to evolution. Okay? And that is what natural selection is. So favorable variations spread throughout the population, eventually changing the population. And this is natural selection causing evolution to occur. So another thing to talk about with evolution is how do we get so much genetic variation? How do we get the variation in the populations? Well, variation comes from things like mutations, where the DNA is changed, and this can introduce new characteristics into a population, which might end up being favorable for the environment. Not always. Sometimes they're not favorable, but in other cases they are. So mutations are one thing that lead to variation. Also, we have recombination. Sexual reproduction in and of itself helps with increasing genetic variation because the chromosomes and DNA can recombine in different ways when the sex cells are forming. And we also get variation in the recombination of the sex cells when they come together to form the offspring. All right. Now that we've talked about evolution, let's talk a little bit about how organisms are classified. And they are classified mainly on the evolutionary relationships amongst them. It used to be, when the classification system was first introduced by Linnaeus, it was based on basically appearances only. But now we not only use what organisms look like, but we refer to how they are related evolutionary-wise as well. So the reason why we want to classify organisms is so that they are easy to identify, so that we can show how they are related to one another, and so that we can actually trace where organisms came from, their origins, what other organisms they evolved from. So here is the modern day Linnaean system that we use. Basically, there are these major categories, starting with kingdom, and we actually do have domains, which is not listed here. Domains are an even broader category above the kingdom, but the primary ones are below that are kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Starting from most broad are kingdoms, so kingdoms include large amounts of organisms, going all the way down, getting more specific, until we finally reach characteristics that are only going to identify a specific type of organism, one species. Okay, so kingdoms encompass many species. Phylums are going to be a little bit more specific, classes a little bit more specific from there, so on and so forth. So a way to remember these categories in the order is with a little saying, King Philip came over for great spaghetti. So that's a way to kind of remember using the first letter of each of the different categories and coming up with a little saying to remember the order that these go in. And over here we're showing the actual classification for a human. So you can see that humans are in the Animalia kingdom, which means that we are heterotroph. We have to go out and get our food. We have eukaryotic cells, cells that have a nucleus. We are multicellular. That's basically the major characteristics of an animal. We are in the Chordata phylum. This means that we have a nerve cord and vertebrae. Okay. Mammalia is the class. So any species that are found in this class, including humans, are going to produce milk. We're going to have hair. We're going to have live births. Those are some of the characteristics of mammals. Primates is the order. So humans are in the primate, and again, this is less species that are going to fall in this order, because primates now also have to have an opposable thumb as one of the main characteristics of a primate. We're in the hominid family. The Homo is the name of the genus, and sapiens is the name of the species. So when we refer to humans by our Latin species name, so to speak, we use not only the species but also the genus. We use the genus and the species, so Homo sapiens. So the last two categories, the genus and the species, are used for the scientific name of organisms, and the genus is always going to be capitalized. The species is always lowercase. Okay, and we always write our scientific names in italics or underline them. If you can't write in italics, then you underline them. But again, notice the first part, which is the genus, is capitalized. The second part, which is the species, is lowercase. Okay, and the reason why we use these terms for scientific names for the organisms, for living things, is because it's based on the Latin language, which is not spoken. It's a dead language, so there's no chances for the words to get changed as far as their meaning is concerned. When a language is spoken, words start to take on different meanings. There's slang. There's all kinds of stuff that becomes makes things difficult, and so you don't always know. Are they talking about that's when you say that's cool? Do they mean that it's a lower temperature cool, or do they mean that's neat? So we have problems with languages that are spoken. So that is why Latin has been chosen, and that is one of the reasons why organisms have a scientific name that is based on these Latin terms, so that all scientists throughout the world will know what you're talking about with no confusion. All right, let's discuss some of the major characteristics of the domains and kingdoms. So I mentioned that there was a broader category above kingdom, and that's called the domain. Domains, there's three of them. There's the archaea domain, which are single-celled organisms that are prokaryotic, so they are bacteria cells that don't have a nucleus. And the archaea domain includes the bacteria that can live in very extreme conditions. So very high temperatures, very low pH, areas with no oxygen. Okay, that's the domain archaea. Domain bacteria is going to be also single-celled bacterial cells. But in this case, these are going to be the bacteria that we are more familiar with, like the bacteria found in your intestines, E. coli, or the bacteria that causes you strep throat, things like that. So the bacteria that are more commonly found and that we are more commonly used to. And then the last domain is eukarya. And eukarya are all of the organisms that have cells with a nucleus, eukaryotic cells. They are going to include the 4 kingdoms: Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista. Okay, so in the kingdom Animalia, which is part of the domain eukarya, we have multicellular organisms that are heterotrophic, with cells that do not have cell walls. Okay, in the Plantae kingdom, also under this domain, multicellular organisms that are autotrophic, make their own food, and do have cell walls. Kingdom Fungi are heterotrophic. They have cell walls as well. So they are similar to plants because they have cell walls. They are different from plants because they're heterotrophic. They are like animals in that case. Fungus have to consume their food. They basically secrete enzymes around them to digest and absorb nutrients. Okay, but notice that it does not say that fungus, anything in here has to be multicellular. There are some fungus in this kingdom that are single-celled, like yeast. Yeast is an example. And then the kingdom Protista is kind of like the leftover. It's kind of like your junk drawer. Everything that is a eukaryotic cell. So the cells have nucleus, but they maybe are not multicellular in the animal or plant kingdom, so it will go here. Or maybe it's a fungus that doesn't quite fit in the fungus kingdom for whatever reason. Anything that doesn't fit in these other 3 kingdoms that is also not bacterial, so these have to have cells with a nucleus. They will go in this kingdom Protista. And I think that is it, yes. So that's just actually starting the slideshow over again. So this was the last slide. So this is the last review session. This covered the basic main points of evolution and natural selection, as well as the main points of classification and how we organize organisms. So I do thank you for joining me. I hope that everyone has a better grip and feels really confident about these different concepts for the EOC coming up. And I wish you all the best of luck. I know you'll do great. Take your time and make sure that you are answering the question that is being asked. It is all multiple choice, but still need to make sure you're answering what is being asked. So just make sure you read the questions carefully. And I do hope you have a good day, and thank you for joining me and taking the time to view these review sessions.